Our bear population was pretty robust before it was settled. Over time, our bear population got pretty low. We think maybe down into the 300s. A Florida black bear has a home range of about 60 square miles for a male and about 15 square miles for females. And of course, that's complicated for bears in the CHAZ ecosystem because there's just not that much area around. So they have to incorporate other places like developments and, crossing major highways to get to other available habitat. And that could be, perilous at times. And one of the issues that we've had over here in CHAZ is that the bear population has been kind of isolated from other populations for a really long time. At one point in time, it had the lowest genetic diversity of any bear population in the state of Florida. That's important because when you starting to have a genetically depressed population, other things, sicknesses, things like that, malformations can arise. This area of Florida, it's considered the nature coast. That's what we call this part of Florida. So there's a lot of water-dominated recreation over on this side of the state. But the thing that's really kind of an untapped gem over here in the nature coast is the uplands. If you actually take a look at this area from a satellite view, you have a coastal marsh that goes into mixed hardwood swamp, which comes into a sandhill pine ecosystem, and then it just continues to move across the landscape, changing every so often. And that's important to manage that kind of ecosystem properly. One of the great things that's happening in Florida is the focus on creating wildlife corridors throughout the state where we can have large animals like bears and panther and deer and other things that are moving back and forth across the landscape relatively uninterrupted. DOT and the state and the counties are all working pretty hard to try to get that accomplished.
The project is taking the Suncoast Parkway from US 98 north to State Road 44, and on the east side and the west side is the Withlacoochee State Forest. And so as part of continuing wildlife movement or allowing the continuation of wildlife movement, we're having a wildlife crossing bridge that will go through this area, will allow wildlife to go through underneath. We also have 4 wildlife culverts, oversized culverts in this area and a little bit to the north that small mammals and reptiles will be able to utilize. When the project was originally being planned back in the 90s, Florida black bear was the primary species that was of concern. And knowing that they're in the CHAZ and they do migrate into the eastern side of Citrus County, we wanted to make sure that there was a safe corridor for them that they could use. It's a new approach. The conversations with the agencies, they felt like that the best way of mitigating the impacts of the roadway were to purchase land in the region that were located adjacent to existing conservation lands that were managed by Florida Department of Environmental Protection, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, or the Florida Forest Service. So the idea was to be able to add on to land that they already own and manage to expand their properties, provide additional benefit to the region as far as conservation for species and for habitat. It's very innovative, and I think it provides a benefit for the state of Florida, for the residents and the wildlife that inhabit this region.
In Florida, having something like the Florida Wildlife Corridor is important because it's not only incorporating conservation lands now managed by the state, counties, local governments, but it's also incorporating private lands. And we want people to have these animals on their lands and appreciate that.
Well, we're like fifth generation Floridians, and we like the wildlife, we like the woods, we like the property to stay like it is, really. When we first came up here, Mike Orlando was doing a study on the bears, and of course he came back here and I went with him, help him track bears, put collars on them, that kind of thing back then. We had a lot of bears get killed on the highway out here by cars, and really I don't think there's that many left in here anymore, but there are some. We've had 2 or 3 bears up here. We had one walk up on the deck all the way around the house, look in the bedroom window, and then we've had bears across the creek stood there and we had one sit there and just sit on the bank and look at us for about 15 minutes. We were offered a tremendous amount of money, and we just decided, no, we want to keep it like this. You probably couldn't find another place like this hardly anywhere, you know.
Just in the last couple of years, we've actually done an updated population estimate. In Ocala, we have about 1,200 bears. In Apalachicola, we're just over 1,000. Down in Big Cypress, we're just over 1,000. The 2 populations that we're really most concerned about in the state are Highlands County. It's about 150. We think that we only have around 20 to 30 animals here in the Chazawitzka ecosystem. And the reason is because they are a little more isolated from the other ones, a little more habitat fragmentation and loss. So we are paying attention to movement of bears across the landscape to get to these populations. That's very important to us. We do worry about the amount of loss of habitat that's going on in the state, and that's why we really support things like the Florida Wildlife Corridor that's moving up and down the state and across the state to increase population sizes and movement.
Being successful at protecting the Florida Wildlife Corridor means that we will have these lands and waters for many generations to come. But we know that we can't do it just with a public dollar alone. That's why we're looking at opportunities to partner with groups like the Department of Transportation to collaboratively work on conservation that will lead to benefits to wildlife while allowing economic development and growth to occur in the most reasonable ways. We know the more that you care about these beautiful wild places in Florida, you will be able to share the message with your community, with your elected officials, and be champions for these places to make sure that we can permanently connect, protect, and restore the Florida Wildlife Corridor.
You and me were meant to be.